In Totnes, there's lots of competing events seeking your attention, so I really don't think you're going to be disappointed by the evenings, but thanks very much for coming. I'm Jonathan, head of the Economics Master's Postgraduate Programme at Geologist College.
And I'm Jay, coordinator of the Totnes REconomy project. So we've organized this as one of an occasional series of talks that we call Adventures in New Economics. We've been doing this off and on for
3-4 years.
quite a while. We've had probably 20 or 30 talks over the years, and we're so excited to welcome Silke and David here, but we'll get onto that in a second. REconomy project. How many of you have heard of the Totnes REconomy project? Fantastic. How many of you are aware of the REconomy Center at the top of town? Great. So the REconomy Center at the top of town, just across from the LAM, is a co-working and incubation space. It is one of the projects in town that I would say approaches the Commons model, but we'll see. It's a pay-what-you-can kind of community resource. And if you're looking for a place to work and connect with other people who are doing things, interesting things, that's a good place for you. Local Entrepreneur Forum or Community of Dragons, how many of you have heard of that? Aha. So this is also a way for the community to support the local enterprises that you'd like to see in the town, ones that are, as I like to say, solutionary. So ones that are going to benefit the community in some way. And we do that every year. We've done it for the last 8 years in a row, and the next one will be in the spring. So if you have an enterprise that needs some funding and support, that could be for you. Or if you know somebody who's got something like that, this could be for you. I guess a couple of housekeeping notes. If you need a toilet, you're in luck because there is one, and it's just right over there by the front door. We do have some expenses associated with this, so this is a sliding scale kind of thing. If you haven't yet contributed, there's a little thing up there on the bar, and if you want to get on our mailing list, we can do that too. Do you want to say something about this?
Sure. Dave and Silke are the really, by way of introduction, I was going to read the official blurb, but actually, if you forgive me, I'm not going to do that, because it's much more interesting, I think. The blurb was actually in the book, describing their backgrounds and current areas of activity and employment. But rather, I'm going to speak in a more personal way, that actually David has been coming, he's been in the guest faculty of the Economics for Transition Master's Programme for a number of years. And I share his conviction that the Commons concept and praxis is a critical bit. It's like a focal point that I think unifies so many of the elements that comprise the emerging new narrative, new paradigm that wants to be born. And so I must say that in the years that I've worked at the college, David's presentations have been among the most illuminating, and I think have helped the students go, wow, that's the focal point. Brilliant. And Silke, I met at a conference in Bollier, reclaiming the urban commons, which was a really tremendous event. There's just so much energy, and one thing I notice about these two is that they're not informal academia. I think they both could be, and they're among a number of people who I know, a number of people who we invite to the college, who recognise that actually, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but my feeling is there's so much freedom, there's so much stagnation within conventional academia, and so much more freedom just outside of the margins. And I notice that Silke and David are among those who I deeply respect as commentators and chroniclers of the new emerging patterns, who have chosen to have a relationship with academia but to retain independence outside of it. As I say, they are great chroniclers of I think it's a re-recognition, it's a remembering of the power of the Commons, kind of a story that got hidden for quite a long time. And I think David and Silke are really helping us through their chronicling in different volumes, this is the third volume that I'm aware of, Wealth of the Commons, Patterns of Commoning, and now just published Fair, Free and Live, that comprise multiple essays, studies of how the Commons actually is resurgent. So thank you so much for making the journey to Totnes, and over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction, and thank you, Jay and Jonathan and REconomy for helping organize this event. It's really, I've heard a lot about Totnes over the years, but this is my first time here, so I'm really thrilled to hear it. I hope be here, and I hope in our conversation I can learn a little bit more about what's going on here, because it seems to be really such a vibrant area of new paradigm creation and development. I'm from the United States. I work for the Reinventing the Commons project at the Schumacher Center for New Economy in Western Massachusetts. And Silke can explain a little bit about herself. And she's in southern Germany and seems to be everywhere in Europe and around the world all the time on Commons. She's a full-time Commons activist and scholar like myself. And we have collaborated in various projects over the years. I'd like to talk about our book for half of the slides, and then Silke will take over and resume the conversation talking about some of the kind of meat of our book. So let me just get...
And you're going to speak for about 45 minutes and then we'll have a conversation?
Yes, about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation, questions, and see where it goes. And I start with this image and a related image of the market and the state, and how I think we don't even need too much explanation about how the market-state system is seriously dysfunctional in so many respects. And we can see the signs from Brexit to Trump to the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, and the failure to meet basic needs, the failure to deal with known problems from climate change to a host of other environmental issues. And I think there's just an increasing lack of confidence that that system of governance can help us solve the problems. And essentially the capitalist storylines are falling apart. And I think that this is leaving a void in our political culture that is really kind of dangerous, because we need some credible new approaches forward. And I think there are many, many promising smaller projects that are yearning to coalesce into something larger. And I like to see the Commons as part of that conversation in helping to give it more definition. And that's somewhat what we've attempted to do in our book. And we're trying to really think, can the Commons help us imagine new pathways for growing a new world? And in addition, how can that happen? And having studied the Commons for 15 or 20 years, often firsthand as well as through the academic literature, we wanted to try to understand commoning, the verb, as opposed to the noun, in a deeper, more refined way. Economics has homo economicus and a whole idealization of what human beings are. So what does the commons mean? What does commoning mean? And those are the kinds of questions we wanted to answer in our books. Free, Fair, and Alive is the English edition, which just came out 2 weeks ago from New Society Publishers, and the German edition came out in April, which Silke was largely responsible for, and she's been on the road quite a bit talking about it, especially in the German-speaking countries. Part of the problem is that so much of the conversation about solutions is bogged down in, I think, a rather archaic debate between shall we have capitalism or shall we have socialism? And some of these, which is not to say that socialism in some form might not have some merits, but it's really a somewhat archaic debate that doesn't grapple with some of the contemporary challenges, especially, I might say, with the rise of the internet and different forms of the way trust, legitimacy, and participation occur. It's more than a state-centric answer that we need. And part of my problem is that the market-state binary has just eclipsed our sense of the cultural memory of the commons And it's not seen as having anything meaningful to say. There's the market and the state as the only significant systems of governance or dealing with problems, and the commons is relegated to this afterthought, if it's thought of at all, as some medieval artifact that we really don't need to think about, or some academic or intellectual thing. And I think part of my mission is to try to recover the commons from the disuse and the smears, such as the tragedy of the commons. Most of you will be familiar with the famous 1968 essay by Garrett Hardin, who was a biologist, who wrote a very much quoted essay, even today, that basically puts forward the fable that if you have a collective resource like a pasture, and everyone is free to put as many cattle on as they want, it will result in the ruination, overexploitation, and tragedy of the commons. And this has been seized upon by politicians and economists as a truism, that collective resources cannot be successfully managed. And therefore, the best solution is to either to give private property rights to the resource so that the market can deal with it more responsibly because investors presumably care more about those resources, or the government. And we know the problems with government. So goes the conservative argument. So the tragedy has really kind of been this dark shadow over the commons for many years. This fable has a lot of embedded political assumptions, and I like the quote by Lewis Hyde, who says it's really the tragedy of unmanaged, laissez-faire common pool resources with easy access for non-communicating, self-interested individuals. Mm-hmm. It's really kind of this libertarian notion of the commons, and moreover, it's focused on the commons as an unowned resource, which is really just an error, because the commons is a social system for managing resources. It's not a resource. And a commons has rules and a community and a system for governance and sanctions against people who break the rules. So he was really describing what I like to call the tragedy of the market, which is precisely about overexploiting the resource and not caring about the external consequences. And it was Elinor Ostrom, an Indiana University political scientist, who really helped debunk the tragedy of the commons thesis through her extensive scholarship over decades. She did lots of empirical research in dozens of countries and helped assemble an international network of scholars to study farmland, fisheries, wild game, forests, and many other shared resources to show that indeed you can collectively manage resources effectively outside of the market or state. For this work, she won the Nobel Prize in 2009. It was the first time a woman has won that prize. And I always find it interesting to note that it was in 2009, the year after the 2008 financial crisis, when they wanted a different type of economist. And in fact, she was a political economist who was studying cooperation as an economically consequential form of human behavior. Imagine that, because the standard economists can't quite go there. So she was really an outlier, but a historic one, and she used the last 3 years of her life after getting the Nobel Prize to help tirelessly campaign around the world to call attention to the value of the commons. Now, one important lesson is that the commons is not just a resource. We need to remember that, because the common usage is often that, the commons is an unowned resource like space or the oceans or the internet. And in fact, there's no social system, so it's not quite really accurate to call those commons, even though we might have moral or ethical claims on those resources. But the commons is really a living, self-organized social system. Now I want to take a brief diversion to talk about enclosures, because the language of enclosures help us understand why the commons are becoming more visible. Enclosures are essentially the coerced privatization, commodification, marketization of our shared wealth, when especially corporations, often in collusion with the state, take over forest lands, farmlands, indigenous peoples territory that has historically been used as not just for meeting survival and subsistence needs, but as a source of cultural identity and peoplehood, and basically takes it over and because the resource can be acquired cheaply or for free. And this is causing all sorts of problems around the world. I consider it really the unacknowledged scandal of contemporary political economy. Because global capital is so eager to get things that are free or subsidized resources and to have the state cooperate in keeping the commoners at bay from maintaining control of their resource. And the state generally often declines to be a conscientious steward of that shared physical or other wealth. And we can see this going on right now with the international land grab in Africa, Asia, and South America, where it's essentially a replication of the English enclosure movement, where sovereign investment funds and hedge funds and others are, in cooperation with governments and elites in those countries, taking over and privatizing the countries, often for speculative purposes, and then displacing the communities that have historically relied upon them, who then have to flee to the cities, creating all sorts of additional problems. And of course, the ecological dimensions of this are huge as well. 20% of the human genome is now privately owned through patents, which has a lot of consequences for what kind of research you can do, or at least scientists are fearful of treading on someone else's research. And there are many, many other enclosures I could go into, but I don't want that to be the focus of this evening. I just want to reference enclosures as a really pervasive problem, which markets will call it progress in human development. It's in fact often dispossession, and of a very severe sort. And this leads me to bring up the notion of how we're often hostage to dated worldviews. In the course of our research for this book, we came across an example in my hometown. I live in Amherst, Massachusetts, of a geologist in the 1840s who was quite prominent, who saw these footprints in sandstone blocks, and he was trying to figure out what they were. And because Darwin hadn't yet published his work, the word dinosaur had not been invented, he could not, and because he was himself within the biblical tradition of understanding the world, are we going to be about biblical revelation or science? He thought they were giant birds or something like that, and could not imagine deep time before the creation. And the lesson is not that he was just a benighted fool, but he was part of a worldview that could not conceptualize or perceive in a different way. And I think that is more or less what I would say is going on today with contemporary market capitalism, where value is metaphysically equated with price, and progress is equated with commodification and marketization of resources. That's how we improve the world. And free trade is really about, it's seen as a way to improve things, but in fact it's more about extraction and dispossession of people. So there's a governing mindset that we need to start to confront in dealing with many of these problems. And I would just say that commoning has to be recognized as generative and value creating in its own right. It may not be monetized in the way market resources are, but it's creating all sorts of value in terms of care work, ecological stewardship, intergenerational connection, and you might even say our human identity and well-being is connected with all sorts of non-market value. So this is really a different worldview and logic and ethos than that we've inherited and that we often continue to propagate in market culture with the help of the state. The Commons is a way, I think, to help deal with some of this mindset, because it's about exploring and developing these bottom-up practical experiments for meeting our needs and governing ourselves in a way that doesn't depend directly on the state and is not ideological and totalistic. It's very practically oriented, much as I might say the transition movement is very much in that spirit. And it's important to note that really the Commons is really better understood as a verb than a noun. Peter Leinbach, who's a really prominent historian of the commons, has said there is no commons without commoning, which means the social practices and the ethical norms and the traditions, the customary practices, and many other things that go into managing a successful commons. So part of what Silke and I have been attempting to do is to get the discussion of the commons from the framework that is usually applied to it by economists and social scientists, which is this rational actor economistic framework, a resource management framework, into one that sees relationality among people and the earth as a primary element of how the commons functions. And this involves, I'd say, a mind shift, almost as great as the geologist Edward Hitchcock I mentioned, and in trying to escape the pervasive mindset of market capitalism today. It's very difficult. In the course of our book, we found ourselves enmeshed in a lot of terminologies and concepts that we said, those are not quite right. We need to escape from them. We needed to see value as a living, co-created phenomenon. And so this was part of the challenge we faced in writing our book, that we needed to escape some of these old languages like the word resource. I just can't use very easily anymore, because a resource implies something that's different from me and humans that we can use however we want, especially as property for market exchange, as opposed to something that is part of me or concerns my well-being. So we tried to invent some terms. One term we use is care wealth. Something that's care wealth is a different category of something than just a resource that we use. And similarly, we like to talk about the nested I, because we're not just atomized individuals with no history, no connection to each other, no shared culture. We're a nested I who are nested in all sorts of collectivities that inform who we are. So these are the kinds of concepts that we've tried to develop in showing that there's different categories of thought we need to start to try on and learn and see how they can describe often practices and realities that we do all the time, but we don't have a vocabulary for understanding that in a self-aware way. And we can talk about some of these other terms later. And I've often struggled with trying to explain how this is an inner dimension of commoning that many social scientists don't really care to go into. But how do we illustrate how the commons changes us inside? And I found this map of the Great Sandy Desert, which is the way we traditionally, we moderns of the West would describe it. But the indigenous people see it quite differently. As you can see, this beautiful work of art, which is essentially their map of the same landscape. And it suggests all sorts of relationality with that landscape in a richer, deeper, inner way than, let's say, science or enlightenment categories might apply to it. So this is where Silke will pick up the conversation and talk about how we've tried to elaborate on this framework and give it some dimensionality.
Thank you, David.
Oops.
Yes, well, I'm really thrilled to be here. I've heard so much about Totnes. I've had conversation with Rob Hopkins as one running around the world, giving these kinds of talks. It's kind of inevitable not to learn about what's going on here, and it's a bit hard to speak to people who are so well informed about what we actually try to find out, and not only informed but doing what we're trying to describe. I think that's the thing. So if what I will say now makes a lot of sense to you, hopefully, then we have done a good job, because it's basically trying to I don't want to say popularize, but to bring coherence, consciousness, awareness to what's going on the ground. And as we started to think about our book, we were doing something that many people do who write this kind of books, which is analyzing the problem, looking at the problem. What's wrong with the market state system? What's wrong with the relationship to the state? Why is market liberalism, capitalism, neoliberalism, flawed, etc., etc., etc. And after almost a year and a half, is that in a way it doesn't make sense to do this because, well, first of all, many other people have written books and made this analysis way better than we could ever do it. And secondly, many of these brilliant books end up with a chapter 10 that then says, oh yes, but there are solutions there out in the world. And then they kind of give you a very rough overview of these solutions. There's transition time out there, and there's comments out there, and there is the solidarity economy out there, and many others. And I feel like, okay, I know this already. How does it actually work? So we decided to focus, especially in part 2 of our book, which is chapter 4, 5, and 6, on how does it actually work? And how can we name it and coin it in such a way that it speaks to people who are actually doing the work on the ground. But based on this idea David was introducing to you, that it's that we realized we were really in a mess of, we cannot use words like work or labor, as if we wouldn't know these kinds of concepts are so tied to wage labor, to the market economy, neglecting what we all know is the care work part. So we were forced into this insight that we cannot properly talk about the commons if not based first and foremost on what we call an onto-shift. We cannot do it if not realizing, understanding, and giving a language to that idea that we are interconnected, all of us, and not only as human beings, but also with the earth around us, future and former generations, etc. So what does it mean to begin a commons discourse and describe commoning as based on a process relational ontology? Ontology, the idea of looking at the world, is that idea of looking through a window. An ontology gives you a window through which you look at the world. And this makes pretty clear as a metaphor that the window you look through defines pretty much the part of the world you are able to see. If I look through that window, I will probably see, what is it? A wall. If I look through that window, I will see a street. And I will start to believe that Totnes is all about streets or Totnes is all about walls. So this is the reason why we think that we need to start with the onto-shift. The book starts actually in chapter 2 with that, a story from Alfred Hitchcock, which is a nice name, right? And with that idea that if we plant an onto seed, it transcends all levels. It will have an impact and effect at a micro level. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Transcend through the meso level, as we can connect as commoners in our regions and beyond, and until the macro level. If we start from the very idea that everything is connected, everything is a flow, everything is a process, then we will devise at every level different types of institutions. We'll just come up with different kinds of ideas. So this, in a way, is to say that the question of scale, which itself is a way of looking in a kind of vertical way at society, is being hacked. Can I say that? So the question of scale kind of turns into how can we actually connect in such a way that we plant an onto seed and an idea can expand and grow bigger and bigger and bigger in an organic way at any level. So how to understand now commoning from that perspective? How to describe that activity that is as old as mankind and as new as Wikipedia or the Federated Wiki, which is the new generation of the wiki that we introduce in our book as well, in such a way that this worldview is already being enshrined. And there was another person helping us out with this, and I'm pretty sure Sussex is not that far from here, right? Is Sussex far from here?
Couple of hours.
Huh?
Couple of hours.
Couple of hours, so it's less far than from my place. Let me put it that way. So it's not that far from here.
6 minutes.
So he's living in Sussex, still living in Sussex. Christopher Alexander, are you familiar with his work?
No.
Can you just hand up? And which kind of area? Architecture, software? Architecture as well. Okay. Christopher Alexander is a really interesting guy because he's a trained mathematician, but then made his international career in architecture. And he has huge building projects throughout the world, which he conceived and enacted, one would say, differently than a normal development of an architectural project is being done. And why is it that way? Because he looks at it as an unfolding whole. Kind of, if I envision something, the whole is already there. And the thing I need to do is to approach the whole, while seeing in each step I go the whole. So what is my technique to see that whole? And he comes up with an idea that he calls a pattern. It's important to understand that a pattern is not kind of a sequence of things, a certain order, like in a paper wall. It is not a model, it is not a recipe. A pattern is, and this is kind of the original definition in one of his most famous, but not the best book, published in 1977, which is a pattern language. And the other one is the timeless way of building. So in these books, in the late 70s, he describes a pattern as the core of the solutions to problems that occur over and over again, and that you can apply 1 million times without ever repeating twice. It's the core of successful solutions to problems that occur over and over again, and that you can apply 1 million times without ever repeating twice. Does this make sense to you? Can you kind of come up with an idea as we talk about community-based economy, localized economy, or the commons? What would be a problem that occurs over and over and over again? Any ideas? What kind of problems do we have when we want to produce together, make and use something together?
Greed.
Sorry? Greed. Kind of people take more than they contribute, for instance, right? Does it sound familiar to people? What
I was
else?
thinking a fixed methodology. A fixed methodology, you have to do it this way.
The kind of lack of creativity here,
Yeah.
right? Or get to a collective understanding of the way to proceed. What else?
The initial excitement kind of ebbing away somehow, like the direction being lost.
The loss of direction, the loss of vision, the loss of common vision, the loss of energy, right? So what do we do then in the market economy? How do we fix that problem?
Control over.
We control or we pay, right? We control or we pay. You can think about controlling or paying as patterns of dealing with that problem, that there is no intrinsic motivation in the market economy. You can think of this as a pattern that makes money rule the world, and our brains and ourselves. So, decision making is another one. I'm sure you have encountered here and then problems with decision making in group. It's a very common thing. So this is a problem that occurs over and over again. And now the idea is you have 1 million different concrete methods to deal with that problem. But all successful methods will somehow have something in common. And this is a pattern. Do I make myself understood? Let's go for a few examples. You remember Elinor Ostrom? The first and until now only women to win a Nobel Prize in economy. And she was very much looking at the commons as community-based governance. as collective governance, right? Where people make their own decisions, where the state should respect the autonomy of commoners to make their own decisions, where they can adapt rules, decide who's in, who's out, set boundaries, etc., etc. So I said, this is really important. I mean, the Ostrom scholarship has not only Enclosures have made commons visible, also the Ostrom School of Scholarship has made the commons visible in the recent decades. So part of looking at the commons and devising patterns of commoning is obviously looking at the peer governance or the self-organization. What Ostrom was not so good at, or not so deep into it, I would say, is what does it mean for the way we relate to each other as human beings? There might be conflicts and methods of conflict resolution, but there might be many other ways to prevent conflicts. There might be many other ways to kind of organize our social life, our togetherness in such a way that peer governance will be a little bit easier. So we wanted to look at this part of the story as well. And finally, commons and commoning is usually coined as an alternative economy. This is also something that Ostrom was not particularly strong in. She was even describing kind of within the firm or an enterprise, you would have cooperation and collective governance, which is true. So, but what does it actually mean to think about the commons as a substantially different way of producing, making and using things and meeting our human needs? So we call it provisioning. And these three areas together, we coined them the triad of commoning. And I was particularly proud of this. I guess David as well, but we finally came up with our design and the triad and the three spheres, etc. This was a few months ago. Today I think that it's terribly outdated. Because there's more to this. What would the legal framework look like if we approach the world from a commoning perspective based on a relational process ontology? What happens with me if I produce as a commoner, think like a commoner, and am like a commoner? It entails a self-transformation, which is certainly not sufficiently addressed in the book. So this is part of that patterns approach. It is always utterly incomplete. It is an offer we make, something that we think makes sense to approach the topic, but there can be way more than what you will see in this slide. These are our 28 patterns, general patterns. We've coined for each of the three areas. Don't make an effort, doesn't make sense. I'll have it a bit bigger for you. And I will try to give you an idea of how we proceeded using 3 or 4 examples. Right? So this is the provisioning part, the economic part. If it is true that the commons is an alternative economy, so then how would we proceed? We would probably look at what does the economy today mean? And what is the most basic definition of economy? What does economy mean to you? What is it all about?
Exchanges.
That's interesting. Who said this? You. That's interesting. Exchanges of what?
Goods and services.
Goods and services. This is the standard neoclassical and classical definition of economy. How would this exchange of goods and services be mediated?
Money.
Through money. So this is, some of you might remember that Aristoteles, 2,500 years ago, had 2 terms for economy, right? One was oikos and the other one was krematistike. So the part of the economy where we exchange goods and services through money was called krematistike. And this is what we today call economy. Where all the care part, all the other stuff that helps meeting our needs is left out. So to me, and even in standard economic books, the basic definition of economy is what helps us meeting people's needs. So this was our basic question. What do commoners do to meet their needs? How do they build houses? How do they produce vegetables? How do they create knowledge? How do they do healthcare, etc., etc., etc.? How do they build machines? What kind of machines do they use? What kind of tools do they use, etc.? And so we did a whole conference on the topic. So we went through these areas. How do the contributions we need, financial, energy, labor, our human energy, come together? How do we allocate the so-called resources? And by the way, it's very, very important to understand, and this is why the commons is really powerful in both so-called natural, dealing with natural resources, but also with knowledge, code, and design. Because if I drink this water, you can only have half of it right now. So there are things that become less as we share them for each one's individual use at a certain moment. Economists call them rivalries. But if I share knowledge about the commons and then we'll have a discussion, I still have my knowledge, you will have more, then you contribute something, I will have more, so there are things that become more when we share them. And so the very basic idea is we cannot use the same, as economists would say, modes of allocation for two things that are so different, such as water and knowledge. And even though what happens in a market economy, how do we allocate knowledge? We consider it a service. We put private property rights on it, and then we trade it as a commodity mediated through money. So we were looking at how do commoners do this differently. And I'll give you a very this one. Have a look at the first one. A very basic idea of how all the resources that we need to produce something come together. For tonight, what did you do? How did you contribute to this event? There's this, what is the term, sliding scale method you use. You just put a pot and you say, contribute what you can. Nobody is forced to pay a certain amount, which means that you lower the hindrance for people to join the event, right? And this is pretty much what patterns are all about. So the basic patterns is that idea of contributing freely, no coercion. Is that the way to pronounce it? No coercion. But the methods for doing so can be very, very different. So you do it on a sliding basis. Other people would do it differently. Other people would, in churches, very often they use a hat or something and run it around. There are whole federations of commons-related projects who completely contribute their money, their energy or their time on a free basis. And a second one, okay, now let me go once more to this. This is on top of the social life because it says a lot about me respecting your condition as a human being, me taking account, being concerned about your condition, me not wanting to make you dependent on the availability of money to join this event. But at the same time, it's a basic pattern of the economy. And so what you see here, it's kind of very close to the provisioning patterns. In fact, the three spheres are closely interrelated. A pattern cannot work alone. They are all interconnected. To put it in a two-dimensional thing is kind of not getting it right because they are kind of all interconnected in three or four dimensions. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the community-supported agriculture, aren't you? Mm-hmm. Who is not familiar with the community-supported agriculture? Good. So I didn't know how it works here in the UK. I had a discussion about it in Preston because I really don't know how it works in the UK, but I can tell you how it works in and the GDR was about. I was born in GDR, right at the border, 500 meters. Sorry. So I can share you my knowledge about my community-supported agriculture and most of them in Germany, which, by the way, go up in number. The first thing they do is, before even producing, well, they come up with a budget for the cost of production for next year, right? Is that the same here? Okay, and then people will kind of decide consciously to be member of that community-supported agriculture, right? And then, I don't know how it is here, but in Germany, we basically say, this is what we need for the production of next year. Please contribute. And then we do bidding rounds. So you do first round, you say, each month, I'm willing and able to contribute 50 euro. And then we sum it all up and we realize at the end of the day, we have 5,000 euro less than we need. Okay, we do a second one. Okay, I will go up to 55. But then usually we have a range of 50 to 100 according to people's needs and capacities and social condition and economic condition. Is it more or less the same here?
In my experience, generally, you don't have the sliding, you would have the...
You have fixed contributions?
In my experience.
That's not the case in Germany.
They're really different. They're really different in different parts of the UK states.
Sorry?
They're really different in different parts, like different schemes run in very different ways.
And this is why I think the work we have done might be interesting, for instance, for people participating in these kind of experiences. Because why is it so important to help people really freely contributing? Not to repeat the pattern of who has money can join, who hasn't can't. Right? So, how does the story go on with the community-supported agriculture? So it's interesting to see how in Germany, community-supported agricultures make sure that people can contribute freely. Most of them define a minimum contribution. That's true. And then what happens next? Everybody contributes before production. And then what happens next? So we'll produce potatoes, onions, tomatoes, whatever. Right? Weather is great. Super conditions. We have loads of tomatoes. You can bring your friends along and pick whatever you want. It's possible. But if, as in our country, in our place, last year we had a tremendous, really horrific drought. And actually, I'm used to think in these terms, in terms of a different kind of economy, of radically different patterns about the community-supported agriculture, and even I was disappointed when I got my share. Because you don't get a commodity anymore. You cannot say, but I contributed, I paid. So I need cucumbers. There are no cucumbers because there were no conditions for producing them. What does it mean? That I don't get it. It means, I don't have this slide, I'm sorry. It means that we share the risk of production. So the basic pattern is we share the risk of production, right? It also means that we practice not direct reciprocity with the producer, but a gentle reciprocity. We agree that the farmer cannot come up with something that under these conditions is impossible to produce. And we are okay with that. We accept it on the basis of a social agreement. Also, another pattern, you can apply it in the community-supported agriculture in whatever other context, is contributing and sharing what becomes more as we share it generously. As I said, sharing water is different from sharing knowledge. So why should we put a cap on sharing knowledge? There is no need for it. Doing this, if you think about it, disrupts the way the current economy is going. I once gave a talk in Bavaria, in Munich, and there were a lot of people from the car producing industry in there. And they do know that 97% of producing a car, of the value that is being produced for a car, is software, ideas, and design. That is things that become more as we share them. And only 3% of it is really material stuff. So what would it mean if we would really freely share software, code, and design as commoners do? And this is why we invite all those people engaged in enacting an alternative economy to reflect on their peer governance. Otherwise, we might not be able to keep commons and commerce distinct. There's very often an assumption that the commons means everything without money, everything without the market, everything without the state. There are people who think very radically about it. But actually, to grow the commons in here and now means to grow the commons within the context of a market state system. That is, we need to consciously come up with designing and envisioning other patterns of doing, making, producing, thinking, and talking, while setting the boundaries to the market and the state.
So, I just have a few more slides before we conclude our talk, in which we try to explain how this general scheme of how a commons works at a micro level among ourselves has implications for the political economy at larger levels. I'm sorry, I have to quickly change to a different slide deck here. We frequently get the question, well, how does the commons scale? Because we're accustomed to thinking of the commons as a very small system. And how can we get it bigger? How can its influence be greater? So that we can build what we call the commons verse, the larger universe of commons-related projects. And we have a certain aversion to the word scale because it tends to imply hierarchical, centralized systems, which are managed from the top and are more prone to corruption and control and politics than something that's distributed and more easily accessible to people and more integrated with their local circumstances. So we think that the idea that the commons can nonetheless have greater influence and expand is less about scaling than emulating and federating, so that people can not replicate in an exact way, but emulate a commons and its patterns for their own circumstances and enact it themselves. It's not a blueprint. And then nonetheless federate among each other so there can be co-learning and an advancement of the general ideas and norms of the commons verse going forward. It's also true that developing appropriate infrastructures for commoning can greatly facilitate and expand commoning. I'm astonished, for example, in the Barcelona, Catalonia region, how Wi-Fi-Net, this alternative Wi-Fi system, is a massive infrastructure for commoning of internet access, which is designed in a different way than the general telecom and cable systems do. And so having infrastructures that are commons friendly can help accelerate and expand commoning too. And there's a role for what we call commons public partnerships, where the state, I'd say most fruitfully at municipal and city levels, can enter into partnerships in which they enable commoning rather than being a bureaucracy with command and control, but provide perhaps the legal authorizations, the technical support, financial assistance, and financing for commoning to occur. These are all ways in which we can build the commons verse over time. And I think one of the guiding principles for this is, again, not having the market state be these joint leviathans who are controlling everything, but realize the next big thing is going to be a lot of small things, much as the internet is a lot of many different pieces loosely joined that nonetheless collectively create really are gushers of creativity and transformation of knowledge and many other things. So I think this is the principle by which a lot of commons will be joined together. And we can't ignore, obviously, the role of state power in how this happens. And I think this is one of the more difficult and complex areas because the state does have considerable resources and coercive power, and many people are oriented to the state and policy as the primary, or some think only, vehicles for achieving change. But I'm reassured by Hannah Arendt's comment that power springs up between people when they act together and it vanishes the moment they disperse. So the very act of coming together as commoners in a cultural and social way is might say a proto-political act, because it's asserting one's own sovereign needs and trying to control it among oneself in a way that neither the state or the market are often aren't interested in doing. So there's a political dimension to this, especially as commoning gets bigger and starts to bump up against some of the received ways by which the market state does things. A longer conversation, but it's something we do need to take seriously in thinking about commons going forward. So with that, we'd like to open this up to a larger conversation and invite some questions from all of you, and Jonathan has agreed to help us with that.
And invite you to sign up our newsletter.
Yes.
Can we turn off the projector?